Gardeners seem almost to have forgotten about chrysanthemums, but if you want a flower that's going to go on being brilliantly colourful when the rest of your garden is starting to collapse into a late season mess, then chrysanthemums are definitely something to try. People think they're difficult to grow, but that's because they're thinking of florists' chrysanthemums, which do have to be grown indoors in a greenhouse and fiddled about with to get great big flowers or to flower at odd times. However, hardy chrysanthemums, which is what this video is about, are very easy to grow, and they will be fine over winter down to about -15 Celsius for Fahrenheit. And if your winters are colder than that, then you can dig them up like dahlias and store them. I haven't myself until this year grown chrysanthemums, so I went to see Dan Cooper of Dan Cooper Garden to ask for chrysanthemum growing tips. To avoid confusion, it's worth saying that Dan Cooper Garden doesn't sell chrysanthemums. He actually gives free gardening advice and sells high quality garden tools, accessories and furniture, and lovely things like garden themed Christmas decorations. But Dan is well known for his love of really colourful flowers, and he does chrysanthemums, dahlias and tulips beautifully. I'll link to Dan Cooper Garden and any other resources we mention in the description below. And if you're new here, the Middle-Sized Garden uploads weekly with tips, ideas and inspiration for your garden. So if you want to see the videos when you open up YouTube, tap subscribe. I made 2 visits to Dan. The first one was in late spring, early summer, to find out what we need to do if we want to start growing chrysanthemums. And then the second one was 5 months later to see the chrysanthemums in flower and find out what we needed to do for winter. So Dan, tell me, if you want to grow chrysanthemums in your garden as part of a herbaceous border, what do I need to know and when do I start?
So the chrysanthemums to go for are the older ones, the Koreans, the rubellums and the spray chrysanthemums. And they are much hardier and much more tolerant of growing in the garden, and in a nice well-draining soil they are fairly hardy and they won't rot away in the winter, whereas some of the greenhouse ones might. Now is a really good time to start, so late spring is when I would get going, and I would get hold of some cuttings or get hold of some plants, and they can, providing they've been hardened off, they can go out in the ground now, and that's a really good way to start. Cuttings you can take from friends or you can buy them online, and it's really surprising because they arrive very small and they grow incredibly fast. So your little tiny cutting will be producing loads of flowers by the end of the year.
I once bought 5 little cuttings, or what I now realise are 5 little cuttings, and they arrived and they were about the size of my fingers, and I put them straight in the ground and of course they died. So can you tell me what I should really have done?
Yes, what you want to do is grow them on in a pot, in a greenhouse, in a shed window or on a window ledge if you like, just for 2 or 3 weeks, because the secret of success is to have a really good root ball formed before you put them in the ground, and then they race away like no one's business. So that would be my trick. They don't want to be too warm, so don't put them anywhere very hot. You can keep them quite cool, don't let them get frosted, but other than that, once they've got a good root ball, that's when to plant them out. I would put them out in late spring, early summer, but in a mild area you could go for, mid-spring, and it would be perfectly fine. So this is a cutting that I've had for about 2 or 3 weeks, and it's been in this pot growing away. It'll have a nice root ball, so it's got some roots coming out of the bottom of the pot now, and that is now ready to be hardened off. The first thing I would do with this though, before planting it out, is that I would pinch it back a little bit, and that's to encourage a nice bushy plant. So I've got one here that I have pinched back, and you can see 2 things are happening with this that happen with chrysanthemums. One is that there's a nice little shoot appearing from the bottom, and that's something that chrysanthemums are brilliant at. They produce underground shoots that come up, and it helps to make a nice clump, so that's a good thing. And also you'll see that there's little side shoots forming already there in the plant, and those are going to make it lovely and bushy later on. And you'll get more flowers as well, which in the garden that's important. If you were showing them for exhibition, then you would want like bigger single flowers. And this one's been pinched back for a couple of weeks now, and you can see there's probably 7 or so shoots, including some little ones coming from the base on that plant, and that is going to produce a really super bushy plant. It will probably get to about 3 foot by 2 foot, and it'll be absolutely covered in blooms from September onwards. And I would want to reassure people that they are really, really easy to grow. I think there's a lot of myth that's built up around chrysanthemums, probably because of a heritage of growing them for the show bench. But to grow them in your garden, they're no more trying than any other plant that you might grow. Add a bit of manure or compost to the soil before you plant them. Blood, fish and bone is really good as well. That gives them, you know, plenty of nutrients to get going. They don't need anything particularly special. The main thing that they want is a free draining soil, so they don't respond too well to a very solid clayey soil. That's because, like many plants, they don't like to get wet feet in the winter. So providing it's free draining, they'll be perfectly fine. And yes, a sunny open spot, and preferably with a little bit of shelter, because the stems get quite weighty when they flower and they've got big sprays of flowers on the top, and you should stake them, but also they will just make a much more robust bush if they're in good open sunshine.
What kind of staking do you need to do?
So I find it's best to stake them individually. You can use anything that you would use, for example, with a dahlia or a delphinium or any other perennial that tends to flop about a little bit. So you can use the round hoops if you've got those, or you can just put a couple of canes in around and put string. It's always better to stake early rather than late. So, you know, do it really soon, and then you won't notice the stakes at the end of the season and they'll look lovely and smart. You're mainly just trying to stop these very brittle stems from breaking apart when they get heavier and sort of opening the bush out. There are quite a few really good varieties, and I would particularly mention one called Dixter Orange, which Christopher Lloyd picked out himself, that needs absolutely no staking whatsoever. It makes a perfect bush, doesn't need pinching out because it sort of pinches itself out and creates lots of branches, and we actually grow it as a hedge here on the allotment and it looks marvellous.
So what about pests and diseases?
So chrysanthemums are pretty marvellous, actually, the hardy ones, in terms of pests and diseases. They don't get very many. It's good practice to remove any dead leaves, because that can cause things like rust and other sort of soil-borne diseases to occur. They don't seem to suffer particularly badly with green fly, because they are coming into bloom much later than the green fly season. So generally our chrysanthemums here would bloom from late summer through to early winter, or even the middle of winter.
So it's now 5 months later, so we went back to Dan to find out what we need to do in winter for chrysanthemums, and also to see how those tiny little cuttings that we saw have grown into great big plants. So Dan, what kind of care did you have to give the chrysanthemums over the summer?
Well, actually, chrysanthemums needed less care than almost anything else that we grow, because they're pretty drought tolerant and pretty tough. They don't mind hot, dry weather, whereas things like dahlias struggled a lot more, and I think people will have found that they needed a lot of maintenance during that very hot weather. But because they don't really flower during that hot period, that comes a little bit later. The plants themselves are really tough, so we did water them. And I'll explain that, you know, that has its own downsides, watering, because it encourages diseases and things to spread a little bit more quickly than normal, but by and large they got by very well with minimal maintenance.
Do you have to deadhead chrysanthemums, for example?
So when it comes to chrysanthemums, deadheading is something that you would do just to keep them looking nice. They don't really set seed in the same way as other plants. They tend to sort of fade, sometimes gracefully, sometimes not so much. So deadheading just keeps them tidy. The flowers last a really long time. Chrysanthemums are a long-lived flower anyway, but of course the weather is cooler, so they don't go over quite as fast.
And now that the winter's coming up, what are you going to do with the chrysanthemums? I mean, do any of them overwinter in the ground, or do you have to dig them up and throw them away, or what?
So the kind of chrysanthemums I grow are all completely hardy in any well-drained soil, maybe not so in the far north of the country in a very heavy soil, but everywhere else they're perfectly hardy. So all I will do with them now is cut them down to about 6 inches above the ground and then give them a mulch. I'm quite careful not to get the mulch actually over the top of the plant. More around is better. If you put too much over the top, I find that they tend to sort of rot away and insects get in there and chew them. But they really don't need very much. You can treat them like any other perennial. I think people consider that some chrysanthemums, that the ones people grow in greenhouses, are a little bit more tender, but garden spray chrysanthemums are hardy as anything. What you would do if you wanted to lift them is almost identical to what you do with the dahlia. So you lift them, you trim the top parts down to sort of about 3 inches, trim the roots back a little bit and put them in trays of sort of old potting compost or straw or anything like that. And the only difference is dahlias you would store somewhere quite dark, but chrysanthemums you would store perhaps in a cold frame or a cold greenhouse or a shed with a window, and you could overwinter them that way if you were concerned about losing them. But really the ones that I grow here are all perfectly hardy and can be left outside all winter.
We talked to you in April about how you group pots to create a border. It was a fabulous border full of tulips and daffodils, and I know you do the same with dahlias. Do chrysanthemums grow in pots?
Yes, chrysanthemums are brilliant grown in pots, and in fact a lot of people, and probably more professional growers, would grow them in pots in order to be able to bring them into a cold, unheated greenhouse about now to have chrysanthemums flowering for Christmas. So they do very well in pots. You can put 2 or 3 cuttings in an 8-inch pot and they will grow very nicely. If you're wanting to create the sort of pot display that we talked about back in April, you would want to choose the chrysanthemums that form a fairly neat dome shape, or be very good at staking them up, because they're not plants with pretty lower quarters, particularly at the point that they start flowering. So you really want them to be a sort of hummock shape, in which case they sort of look a bit like an dollop of ice cream on a cone when it's in a pot, or you would want to have something that hides the bottom parts when they're blooming.
Dan also gave me some cuttings of chrysanthemums from his garden. He gave me chrysanthemums E.H. Wilson and burnt orange. And I think they've been a great success. They've survived really well through this hot, dry, difficult summer. And they're in flower now when pretty much nothing else is. I should have staked mine better. They've got a bit sprawly, but that's entirely my fault. Chrysanthemums go really well with other late season flowers like dahlias and salvias. So if you want to know how to grow salvias, don't miss my interview with the UK's top salvia expert in this video here. And let me know what you think about chrysanthemums. Do you love them or hate them? And thank you for watching. Goodbye.